Welcome. Today we have the honor to hear from Dr. Jon Pahl about his book, Fethullah Gulen, A Life of Hizmet. Here. Dr. Jon Pahl is a historian, author, teacher, pastor, researcher, business planner, and community activist. Dr. Pahl received his BA in History and Theology from Valparaiso University, MTS from Trinity Lutheran Seminary, and his PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School. He has published numerous articles and reviews and 7 books, most recently the first critical biography in English of the Turkish Muslim preacher Fethullah Gulen. With that, welcome, Dr. Pahl. It's great to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Zara. It's great to be here, and I look forward to our conversation very much. I'm eager to talk about this book.
Thank you. With that, I'll just start asking you questions. Could you tell us a bit about your journey as you wrote this book? What drew you to write the critical biography of Fethullah Gulen?
I was introduced to Fethullah Gulen in 2007 at an iftar dinner in Philadelphia. I received an invitation from Philadelphia Dialogue Forum. I had no idea who they were. And I have to admit, I wasn't entirely sure what an iftar dinner was, so I really wasn't sure what I was walking into at all, but was very warmly welcomed. And the keynote speaker that night was Father Tom Michel, who at the time was the Vatican's chief interreligious officer. And he was honestly a terrible speaker because he just read to us from a book. And once I got over being judgy, I started listening to what he was saying. And he was reading from the English language toward a global civilization of love and tolerance. That's a collection of Hoja Effendi's essays. And once I started really listening, I said, this is great. And that was the beginning. Changed my life, that iftar dinner, because my wife and I were invited to go to Turkey in 2007. Actually, for our 25th wedding anniversary. We spent our 25th wedding anniversary on a boat on the Bosporus, which was a very memorable way to do that. And then the more I read about Mr. Gulen, I very much saw him in the context of religious peace builders. In 2010, I completed a book on violence and religion. The book is entitled Empire of Sacrifice, The Religious Origins of American Violence. And it was a hard book to write. So honestly, I was looking for a happier topic to write on and started researching Mr. Gulen. And in 2010 was at a conference at the University of Chicago about the Hizmet community, where I learned that people within the Hizmet community wanted a biography, a critical biography of Mr. Gulen. So I thought, maybe that would be something I could do. And at the time, things were going very well in Turkey. You know, Barack Obama had made the first state visit of his administration, of his presidency to Turkey. And I thought, well, okay, this is a happier topic for me to write on. And I said, I thought I would start kind of a leisurely research project. It was not the primary research project I was working on, but I knew I needed to learn some Turkish. So, and the Gulen Institute was kind enough to help me study Turkish, and then working on the project slowly. And then, of course, July 15th came along, and that changed everything. And I realized I needed to work much more quickly in order to get the true story out about the slanders that I saw circulating relating to Mr. Gulen and the people of Hizmet, to do what I could to correct the injustices and the human rights violations that were circulating. So that became my motive then, and it became, in fact, a book that has many tragic dimensions to it now. But there hadn't been a critical biography of Mr. Gulen in English previously, and to be completely honest, the Turkish versions tended to be hagiographies by insiders or smear jobs, hit jobs by outsiders. And so I thought, I need to listen to everybody and bring my perspective as a historian of religions to bear on writing this, and I hope I hit the right tone.
Definitely. We appreciate your efforts. And I do agree with you about the previous biographies. They tend to be like two complete opposites. So it's definitely like a great opportunity to get to hear from you a fresh perspective. And I also wanted to ask you about about your intention of not wanting to meet Fethullah Gulen until you drafted the first draft of the book. And when you did meet him, what were your first impressions? Did anything surprise you? You're muted now.
I chose not to meet with Mr. Gulen in order to maintain a degree of objectivity. It would have been far easier if I had met with him earlier and frequently. But it would have been a very different biography then, I think. So I made the conscious choice to maintain some distance, while at the same time I was talking to all kinds of people both very close to Mr. Gulen. There was a group of 4 of us who would meet to read chapters as I was working on them, and so very closely connected. And I was talking to people who were strong critics of Mr. Gulen and Hizmet as well. Mustafa Akil in particular, but Danny Roderick and others. So maintaining that objectivity. When I did meet with Mr. Gulen, 2 meetings in February of 2019, I have to say I wasn't really surprised by what I discovered, because he is the same person in person as he has been throughout his career, throughout his vocation as a scholar and a preacher and a writer. I guess what did surprise me a little bit was sort of the gleam in his eyes and the very gentle sense of humor that he displayed. There are times in his writing that there are, little glimmers of it, sort of satire, or when he's telling a story. But that's hard to find, in as clearly present in the writing as it was in meeting him in person. So that the biggest surprise, I guess, was that gentle sense of humor about him, and it's something we shared, so I was able to appreciate that, and I really did. I liked him. It's a simple thing to say, but it may be the most important thing I drew from it, because here I have spent almost 10 years of my life doing research, and what if after I conclude the book I discover I really don't like the person I've written? Well, that would have been unfortunate, but we hit it off. And I guess speaking theologically a little bit, what I came away from very clearly is his commitment to living a life pleasing to God, or for God's good pleasure. The strength of that became apparent to me, and is, of course, consistent with the influence he's had then around the world too. When we really dedicate ourselves to an ideal, to a practice like that, to the greatness of God, other things tend to fall in place. And it seems to me that is the situation for him too. No matter how bad things get, no matter how many struggles he faces and has faced in his life, there's always that horizon of God's pleasure as a goal. And I saw that reinforced when I met him in person.
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer. My next question is going to be a little bit more about the process of researching for the book. And you wrote a very detailed biography, and I imagine it must have been really interesting to go to all the places and talk to all these people. You kind of mentioned it, but what was that process like? What were your major takeaways from that process?
Well, it was the best research project in my life, simply put, in that I don't think I could have written the biography without knowing the places where he lived and worked. So I followed in his footsteps pretty much, going to the village he was born in and raised for his first few years anyway, Korajuk. Poor place, right? And isolated, in a cold part of Turkey. I mean, I imagine their winters are probably a lot like ours here in Wisconsin, with the snow on the ground, about a foot of it right now at -2 degrees Fahrenheit. Sorry for the little disturbance in the video there, but I think people will appreciate it. So seeing Korajuk and Erzurum, of course, where he attended Madras, and just the milieu steeped with piety, his family's burial plot, where it's not military figures who are lifted up, but scholars. And, that was really important for me to see and to know. And then, of course, following in his footsteps to Derna, and seeing that mosque-filled city, and yet that secularist city too, in many ways, that real interesting tension, and being made aware of that and sort of seeing it playing itself out was really crucial to me. Seeing the window box where he slept in the mosque, gives me a visualization and an experience of the modesty that's been such a crucial component throughout his life. I could go on and talk about the other places as well, and just sort of take you on a little travelogue with me to Izmir and around the Aegean, and then to Istanbul, of course. But I think that's probably, or that was a crucial component to my research as well. And yeah, talking to so many people in Izmir when I was there, I had to move constantly because of the police surveillance was significant, and really had some incredible interviews that allowed me not only to gain information, but also to make friends. And that was beautiful. I mean, so in addition to visiting these extraordinary places, these historic places, I also met incredible people and made friends. Yusuf Pekmezci in particular. I mean, we had to postpone our interview 3 times because he was being, pursued by the police. And when we finally did meet, we had such a good conversation. He was such a loving, intelligent, and thoughtful man, and a great storyteller too, that we kept talking and kept talking and kept talking, and I missed my plane where I was supposed to be going. So that's just an example, of the conversations I had and the insights I gained and the friends I made. Many friends who are now, have had to flee or in trouble in prison or have died. At the same time, it's research like that is really exhausting. I mean, it's very, very tiring. Hotels, we think of them as sort of glamorous places, but you check into the hotel, you take your bags up the elevator, and then there's this long hall of rooms that look all exactly like yours, and you don't know anybody in them, and it's exhausting. It's wearisome. It's lonely. And I felt that acutely. I mean, I have a loving family who I enjoy very much. And that all kind of had to go on hold in order to get this book done. But it, again, was the best research project of my life. And I honestly think it's the best book I've written.
Thank you so much. My next question is going to be about the impressions that you gained from viewing Islam through the perspective of Hizmet. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd studied Islam at the University of Chicago. My PhD was primarily in religions in the United States, but Islam is one of the religions in the United States. Excuse me. And then I concentrated on Western religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, although they're all global traditions as well. So I knew a lot, or I knew some things, not a lot. I knew some things intellectually. And I had dialogues. I participated in dialogues throughout my academic career, which it was like 20 years by the time I started doing this research. So I knew some things about Islam, but this project allowed me to really expand my understanding of the depths of Islam and in particular Sufism. And it gave me, I think it's fair to say, a corrected perception of what Islam is all about. In the United States after 9/11, there was a concentrated effort to generate Muslims as enemies in the United States. And even though I resisted that, I wrote against it, I knew it wasn't true, it nevertheless kind of informed, sort of in the background, right, unconscious biases that I had. And studying the life of Gulen and seeing how Islam is put into practice among people of Hizmet helped me realize how and why Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. Because this is authentic Islam. This is the Islam of hoshguru, of tolerance, and the Islam that is that cares for each other, cares for the stranger, that puts into practice many of the ideals that Christians like myself claim, and yet struggle in practice to do. So it really opened up for me an understanding beyond the intellectual of, say, the power of prayer in the life of a Muslim. How this 5 times a day reminder, right, is an incredible foundation. And I'm looking for my Tesbih to share with you all right now. I received it in Air's room. And I had it out on my desk the other day, and I thought I'd put it away where it belongs, but in fact, I didn't. But I have another one here. So, just on a practical level, I learned another way to pray with a Tesbih, with prayer beads, and that practice has changed my life for the better as a Christian. Right? I have learned from my Muslim sisters and brothers how to be a better Christian. And that, it seems to me, is the goal of all interreligious dialogue, not to convert another, although in some cases that happens, but to increase the awareness of those common practices we have and the deep values that we share. And finally, the deep peace, as I put it in the book, that is at the heart of all of our traditions as I see it, and why they have lasted for millennia. You know, we like to think of nation states and governments as powerful and things like that. Nah. Even the, you know, most enduring empires, say the Ottomans, you know, it's hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 at the most, and yet our historic religious traditions, Hinduism is 5,000 years old, Judaism the same, Christianity, Islam, all of these traditions endure because they have this capacity for deep peace. And I learned that anew and was able to give it some very specific links in my study of Mr. Gulen's life.
I appreciate that. And I really like how you mentioned that the purpose of dialogue is not to convert each other, but to really like understand one another and also to delve deeper in your own practices, I think, as I've come to realize it on my own. So I wanted to ask you about the one of the themes in the book was the principle pluralism. And I think it ties well into our conversation just now. Could you kind of expand upon that idea? You're muted.
Thank you. So Harvard's Diana Eck, in her book, Encountering God, A Spiritual Journey from Bozeman to Benares, put together a typology of religions, you know, sort of cutting across religions. And she says, religious traditions can be exclusivist, inclusivist, or pluralist. And the way what she means by that is that, you know, within and across religious traditions, there are some who believe, the exclusivists who believe it's, you know, my way or the highway. You know, my way's right, your way's wrong, right? Us and them. And those who don't agree with us are excluded. Inclusivists are more tolerant, more open, but still have real limits, right? Will say, you're included so long as you agree with practice in the same way, etc., something like that. So it's not exclusivist, it's inclusivist. The third way, the pluralist, then, often gets understood as relativism. That is, anything goes. That's not what she means by it, but that's often how it appears. And so by talking about principled pluralism, what I wanted to overcome is that perception that because you agree with what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs calls the dignity of difference does not mean you don't have principled positions yourself. And it seems to me the best dialogues, in fact, come when the participants know who they are, so that they can then recognize where the differences are and engage those differences constructively rather than defensively or in a hostile fashion. And this is what I see as the heart of the Hoshguru in Hizmet. That was a nice sentence. Heart of Hoshguru in Hizmet is this notion of principled pluralism. That is, we know who we are faithful Muslims, you know, practicing the Sunnah in continuity with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And at the same time, we're citizens of the world and want to work with others who are different than us on those things where we can work together, right? Not compromising our tradition, right, our practice, but extending an invitation to work together in education, in poverty alleviation, in healing, and in environmental improvements, in the whole range of social enterprises, of businesses that exist to strengthen the common good. So that's what I mean by principled pluralism, and it's what I see again as the heart of Hoshguru in Hizmet. is this, capacity to know who you are and then to see others kindly or nicely with eyes of tolerance as a result. So that's principled pluralism, and it's very much needed in our world today.
Thank you for that. My next question is, there's a big emphasis on nonviolent practices as it pertains to making a more peaceful and just world in the book. And how was this idea presented through the life of Fethullah Gulen?
Yeah, he's a peace builder. He is in, as I see it, very much in the tradition of from Mohandas Gandhi in India to Lima Boy in Liberia, and with lots of stops in between. Peace builders usually encounter resistance because there are powerful forces allied with militarism and violence in our world. And so those people who believe that we can achieve peace often encounter resistance and actually increase conflict in some contexts. That's certainly played itself out in Mr. Gulen's life, even though he has consistently been an advocate for nonviolence and for nonviolent practices such as prayer and Hajj and fasting, all the pillars of Islam. Again, faithful in his practice to a fault. People have constructed him as this political figure, even though he's not. And so, as I put it in the book, his life has been politicized for him while he has consistently disavowed politics. So he sees Islam as peace, as this deep peace, deeper than political peace, deeper than social peace even. It is this spiritual peace that is then the source of healthy families, of healthy communities, of healthy societies, of healthy nations, that flows from this practice of Islam. And he's presented it consistently from the very beginning, when he was working at the mosque school in Kastana Pazar, with the kids there, in his preaching, in his teaching, in his writing. It's been completely consistent. We must be handless to those who hit us, tongueless to those who curse us, right? And that has been lived out by him and by those who are inspired by him, which makes it so ironic and tragic that people close to Mr. Gulen and people even tangentially related to Mr. Gulen have now been targeted as terrorists. It is truly one of the great tragedies of the first decades of the 21st century. Now, of course, we have the pandemic as well, which has exacerbated things and made things worse for so many, economically, politically, biologically as well. So nonviolent practices are at the heart of Hizmet. I mean, service is inherently nonviolent. Hizmet is inherently nonviolent. Were there individuals within Hizmet who gained some power, may have been drawn away or fallen into violence? I don't have access to those sources, but from all the evidence I see, that standard of nonviolent practices is the heart of the Musbat Harakat, the consistent positive action that Mr. Gulen has taught and lived.
Thank you. And as I read your book, I think it reminded me of the core of Hizmet, what it means, as someone who is kind of like born into Hizmet, if you will, with parents and friends who are always like involved in Hizmet. It's kind of a fresh take to just kind of view it from a different perspective. I really appreciated it. So my next question is going to be about hoşgörü. Hoşgörü translated as tolerance is the backbone of the Hizmet movement, as we just said, and it's also mentioned in many chapters in the book. There have been racial threats and racial violence and crises going on around the world and in the US. And Mr. Gulen has always emphasized hoşgörü in his speeches and books and wants to build peace islands. And can we hear from this perspective in terms of hoşgörü tolerance from you? And what is the space of tolerance and how does it contribute to world peace, especially in terms of in light of these injustices happening around the world?
That's a great question, Zara. Thank you for that. So hoşgörü is the heart of Hizmet as I see it. This practice of altruism, of caring for others, of attending to others. So much of life is just showing up and paying attention, right? And so that's part of it. But it's Professor Scott Alexander's interpretation of hoşgörü that really opened it up for me. We were at a conference together in Accra, Ghana. First time that Catholic, Protestant, and indigenous practitioners had been brought together in such a setting in Ghana, in the history of Ghana, and it was inspired by Turks, by people connected to and inspired by Mr. Gulen. So this wonderful historic event. I was so pleased to be a part of it. And Scott, Dr. Alexander, that day gave his talk on hoşgörü, and he interpreted it as like this. His Turkish is much better than mine, and his Arabic is way better than mine. He said, it's a compound word, right? It means to see nicely, right? And that made sense. I certainly saw plenty of that from among people of Hizmet, people smiling and being friendly and sincere as can be. But then he said, theologically, we can interpret hoşgörü as it's used by Mr. Gulen as to see others as God sees them. And that means to see them with eyes of mercy and compassion. And I thought, that's it. There is this theological element at work here, holding one accountable to see this way, to act this way, and giving an example, right, of how we are to act as well. So, and once I sort of became aware of that dimension of tolerance, it opened it up for me completely. Because, and thank you, Dr. Alexander, again, because tolerance in English is a kind of a weak word. I mean, okay, I'll tolerate you, I'll put up with you. But that's not how it's practiced in Hizmet. It's much more, I want to work with you. Let's find ways to extend mercy and compassion together, right? That it's active. It's not this sort of passive, I'll put up with you mentality. And that's, to my mind, really important around the world. Where I see analogs are in the, as a Christian, in the ecumenical movement, so-called, the movement of Christians to come together in dialogue, which really just began in 1910 at a World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh, and has since led to the founding of the World Council of Churches, which is headquartered in Geneva, this big organization that gets Christians together to work together. We don't all agree on everything, but we recognize that we can all work together on some things. And that's a huge change in the history of Christian relations. And the same thing is happening in interreligious dialogue, which has even less of a history than the Christian ecumenical movement, but arose around the same time. And especially in the founding of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in 1914, which continues. But so there are these agencies that exist to bring people together across traditions, not to convert each other, but to find out what we can work on and how we can work together more effectively. And I see Hizmet as sort of an internally grown articulation of those global trends. And it's why I find it so important and, you know, speak as an advocate for Hoşgörü myself, because it's what I see as the leading edge of religious activity around the globe will be in the practice of Hoşgörü, in finding ways to work together from the deepest wells of our traditions, addressing the most serious problems that we face as human beings.
Thank you, Dr. Pahl. So my next question is going to be about your thoughts about the future of Hizmet. What do you see changing, or what do you see improving, if you will? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I will say I'm a historian, so I look backwards rather than forwards, and nobody has a crystal ball. But here's the pattern I see within Hizmet. And it is as follows. Every time that political forces, police, whatever, have sought to squash Hizmet, to kill it, Hizmet's grown stronger. It's like did you see the tulip there? That was my version of a tulip, you know, an Ebru painting. And I think that is the future for Hizmet, is that the analogy here is when Hoca Efendi had to go on the run for 6 years. So from 1981 to 86, I think it was, 80 to 86. I'd have to go back in my book and look for the exact details. Slip away in our memories. But for those 6 years, the government was harassing him, right? And yet, during those 6 years, he was traveling all over Turkey, developing friends, networks, and trying out ideas, starting businesses. I mean, he wasn't starting businesses, but people inspired by him were starting businesses. And something similar is happening now, as the government has put together a ruthless, unjust, human rights violating repression. People inspired by Mr. Gulen have had to land in Belgium, France, Spain, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Indonesia, South Africa, Nigeria, and Austin, Texas. And that could destroy it by dispersing it. It could also be the scattering of seeds that now are going to flourish into interesting new hybrids, right, with real beauty, that then have the capacity to change the cultures where they land too, to improve them through businesses, through education, through Muslim presence in places where there may not have been much of a Muslim presence before. And so that's both my expectation based on previous patterns, on the evidence of history, and also my hope, right? And it's nice when those two things can align. But finally, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know. And, you know, the variable factors are, well, how much influence does the Turkish government have in various countries to make things difficult for people, really difficult in some cases? And what are the external factors in history that are likely to disrupt the flourishing of Hizmet? And those factors, you know, are these big problems that we have as human beings to address, namely, you know, climate change. it's huge. And inequality, the economic inequality that in the United States in particular is really impeding flourishing of people and of our culture as well. But those are common problems we face, certainly not only problems for people of Hizmet. Okay, maybe one more, and then take questions from people.
Yes, yes. So my last question is actually about your new book, if you don't mind talking a little bit about that. It's called A Coming Religious Peace. Would you be able to talk a little bit about that? Tell us anything that you might be able to.
Well, it's still very much in process. And that was the book I started working on before, I turned my full attention to Mr. Gulen's biography. So, and that the vision for the book has changed over time. But basically, the thesis is interreligious peace building is the most significant story in the history of religions in the 20th and early 21st century that nobody knows. In other words, that religious people working together to transform societies nonviolently and peacefully towards greater justice has been happening all over the globe and in context after context. And nobody knows this. Nobody recognizes this. There's the leading sort of understanding of religions around the world, and especially in the news media and to a degree in intellectual circles as well, is that religions are part of the problem, right? Religions impede progress. Religions, are driven by stereotypes, and religions are prone to violence. I mean, all of these kind of discourses are out there, which those of us who practice a tradition know isn't true for the vast majority of us, right? There are bad actors in every religious tradition, no question about that. But the teachings of those traditions don't incline to that kind of bad acting. And that's the argument I'm making, looking at the evidence of the 20th and early 21st century in a couple specific cases, and then in the history of the United States as well. We've seen a recent example of this in the transition to power here in our political system. You had individuals wearing crusader clothing, carrying crosses, wearing a Camp Auschwitz t-shirt, enact violence against the US Capitol. And yet, you had a transition of power featuring music like Amazing Grace and an incredible poem by the Youth Poet Laureate of the United States, and spiritual practices that point us toward peace and how we can get along. And so I want to lift up those practices and the historical examples of them. And so inevitably, Hoja Effendi and Hizmet will be a part of that book too. And it's still a couple years away, I think. You may or may not know, I've been serving as a pastor of a church for the last 3 years, and that's been full time, and is I have the capacity to step back from that a little bit coming up here, and I think that'll give me more time for my research, which I'm looking forward to.
Wonderful, thank you. And it seems like we didn't have any questions on YouTube. So I think this might be our last, this might have been our last question. I really appreciated your time in talking to us about your book. Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
Zara, enjoyed conversing with you as well. Have a nice rest of your Saturday. Peace.
Thank you.
Bye.